Thanks everyone for coming, especially on this balmy evening, probably the last warm evening we're going to have for about 6 months. So thanks for sacrificing it by being upstairs in a pub. I've already joked about this, but this is hopefully going to be the start of a very special tradition, and everyone in future will boast that they were here. 50,000 people will be like the Sex Pistols in Manchester. But we happy few can say we were actually here for the first Canon Club. I'd like to thank Will, who's there in the corner eating, who's actually organised everything, and he's sort of forced me to do this because because I wrote about this on my Substack, which I should plug, I suppose, but I wrote about it earlier in the year how I wanted to set up this club where people would go and talk and listen to talks about culture and sort of fill in all the sort of gaps in their knowledge. I wrote about it, and I thought, but then Will kept on saying, "Yeah, why don't we actually do it?" And I said, "Okay, we'll get it done." And it's a great pleasure to start it. But it was sort of inspired by my own kind of lack of knowledge, my embarrassment about there being so many gaps, so many things, especially in poetry and history of art, that I just don't know. And I obviously must have had a misspent youth, just wasting my time not learning things. I remember, like, there was a few years ago, I interviewed Jacob Rees-Mogg, and I asked him a question, and he replied with a line of poetry, and I just went, yeah, great, that's really... And I obviously didn't know the quote, and I Googled it afterwards, and it was Kipling, and I just felt so, so embarrassed that I didn't know that. I just, wasted my time. So, the inspiration is partly salons that used to be a big thing in the 18th century. People would go along and listen to a speaker and improve themselves. And I felt like there isn't really something that's orchestrated, organized that we do. I know there are lots of different salons, and people reply, there are things that go around, but there's nothing kind of national or sort of organized that people do it. And there isn't a sort of culture, a wider culture, where people can learn about these things. I always watch television and listen to radio and feel that it's so mind-numbingly lowbrow most of the time. And there are YouTube channels, people can learn about these things, but it's a very kind of isolated thing going on the internet. You don't talk about it around in the office the next day, and there isn't the kind of shared culture. So I wanted to do something where people could go and do it communally and then talk about it afterwards. And finally, it's happening. So in Clerkenwell, which is a sort of great place with a great tradition of it's a great place for like religious cults and meetings. It's a big place for the Quakers in the 7th century, the 8th century, and all these other sort of tiny little sects. And it was actually where Lenin first had his meetings as well. Pretty much very close to the spot where the sort of 17th century dangerous radicals got together. So hopefully we'll be in that great tradition. I mentioned, sort of off the top of my head in the first article, about the various things I wanted to learn about, and I mentioned Virgil and Van Eyck and Milton, and it was just happened to be one of the things I felt I didn't know enough about. So it's great that Milton is in fact the subject of our first talk by Jaspreet Singh Boparai. That's just worried I pronounced your name slightly wrong, but I've got it, I think, which is about Paradise Lost, but also Dr. Johnson's life of Milton. So I know about Dr. Johnson, he's in Blackadder, isn't he? So yes. I know that. Jaspreet you're the joint founder of Antigone Journal. That's the main thing we want to plug, which is an online journal for the advancement of the classics and the understanding of the classics, which is a great sort of cause. And you are a classic scholar as well as a historian of art, and that knowledge of Greek and Latin is obviously very important, because Milton, as the speech will say, has lots of references, classical references, which a lot of people just wouldn't get. So the talk's going to be about 45 minutes, if that's all right. Then we're going to have a break, and then there's going to be questions and chats, and I think it's going to be a bit less organized after that. So anyway, it's very exciting, and thanks very much for coming. So I will leave it to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Ed, for inviting me And thank you, Will, for organising this. I am going to stay very tightly close to my script because I have no self-control. So I apologise if I'm looking down at it a little bit too much. But let's begin without further ado. Of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos, or if Sion hill delight thee more, and Siloa's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Ionian mount, while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure, instruct me, for thou knowest, thou from the first wast present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like satst brooding on the vast abyss, and madest it pregnant. What in me is dark, illumine; what is low, raise and support, that to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to man. So begins John Milton's Paradise Lost, the greatest poem in the English language, and perhaps the single most impressive monument of British civilization, because, as Dr. Johnson rightly said, and I quote, "The chief glory of every people arises from its authors." Poets do not found nations, but they are their prophets, and they create in people's minds a vision of who they are and why they exist. No other work created by the hands of men can last as long as a poem. Nothing else shapes men's vision to the same depth. Why should anyone aspire to be a poet? Because the greatest poets not only enjoy fame themselves, they create it for others. You are not truly celebrated if nobody sings about you. This is the ultimate power of the poet. John Milton was born in 1608. In 1667, he published Paradise Lost, which is, without question, the greatest poem to have been composed in the British Isles. But is he the greatest poet in the language? Surely Shakespeare's genius is more formidable. Look at his range, his versatility, and the sheer breadth of his human sympathies. Yet not even he created anything as grand as Paradise Lost, which has no competitor as the English national poem and the founding epic of this kingdom, as it was restored in the years after the Civil War. Of course, there is a certain irony to this. Paradise Lost is the creation of a man who was by no means a model subject of his monarch, or an obviously loyal one, or even a willing one. Indeed, Milton might fairly be described as a regicidal maniac, whose political views were arguably even more extreme than those of Guy Fawkes, the noted Catholic terrorist. He applauded the beheading of King Charles I, and indeed celebrated it in a series of pamphlets now, alas, little read. It seems a miracle that he was not executed for treason after the Restoration in 1660. Milton's theological views are perhaps less heretical than has often been claimed. He was, by the standards of 17th century Protestants, not necessarily extreme. yet he had no fondness for the established church. Nobody could deny Milton's patriotism, yet he appears to have had no fondness for the common mass of humanity, beyond that relatively small proportion of it that was educated by him personally, or at Cambridge, and ideally both. Few could call him a unifying figure. We might also question at least some of his poetry. Milton's masque Comus, performed at Ludlow Castle on Michaelmas 1634, and his pair of meditative pastoral poems, L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, first published in 1645, are justly celebrated, not least for their richness of language. What about his sonnets? The 19th, on the poet's blindness, is perhaps the best known of these. It runs as follows. When I consider how my light is spent ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide, lodge with me useless, though my soul more bent to serve therewith my Maker and present my true account, lest he returning chide. Doth God exact day labour, light denied? I fondly ask. But patience to prevent that murmur soon replies, God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts, who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. His state is kingly, thousands at his bidding speed, and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. We all remember the last line, but this is not really much of a poem, is it? Certainly not by Shakespeare's standards or those of John Keats. Would anybody bother about it if it had not been written by Milton? Here we grudgingly admit the need for literary criticism. These days, literary criticism amounts to a form of philosophy for people who failed maths at school. In its most sophisticated form, literary criticism is a device for helping explain how a given academic spent 7 years at Cambridge, was awarded a doctorate in English literature, and still has not memorized a single Shakespearean sonnet. But in its less degraded form, literary criticism is merely an exercise of judgment. In learning how to evaluate literature, you train yourself in examining the world around you and making judgments that affect your own life. The discipline is thus not entirely useless. Also, the quality of literary criticism in a given society is a useful index of freedom. If you cannot speak your mind openly about literature, you cannot do so about anything else. Criticism is where tyrants begin to police what you can and cannot say. As a discipline, English literary criticism came into its own in the 1660s, as the nation tried to make itself whole again after a generation of civil strife and dictatorship. The father of English literary criticism was the poet John Dryden, who was born in 1631, died in 1700, and served as the nation's first poet laureate. Dryden was a professional writer. He worked exceptionally hard and thought even harder about what he was trying to create. His prefaces to his various plays, translations, and long poems are the first real examples of modern English prose. Also, here we have a writer systematically trying to come up with a practical rationale for what he was doing and why. But Dryden wrote chiefly about his own compositions, or else Latin literature. He knew and admired Milton and recognized Paradise Lost for what it was, but it took another generation for this new intellectual discipline of criticism to come to terms with the scale of what Milton had accomplished. Joseph Addison is remembered today as the pioneer of the modern English essay. He founded the original Spectator magazine, and in 1712, he published a series of papers in the magazine on Paradise Lost. These are not necessarily gripping reading, but their historical importance is beyond question. Addison established beyond doubt that Milton's poem was an authentic classic, in the sense that it could be spoken of in the same vein as the work of Homer, Virgil, or Ovid. With Paradise Lost, the English language itself had come of age. Yet Addison tended to downplay the more controversial aspects of the poet himself. Obviously, there is a respectable argument for doing so. All the same, it seems a mistake to separate the man from his work, at least in this case. The single finest assessment of both Milton and his work remains that of Dr. Samuel Johnson. Johnson's Life of Milton is a classic in its own right. If you want to learn how to judge literature, begin here. There will never be a better or fairer introduction to Milton. Johnson was not an academic. The son of a provincial bookseller, he was born in Lichfield in 1709, just under 30 years after Milton's death. We know Johnson principally from James Boswell's Life of Samuel Johnson, which is in itself a considerable literary accomplishment, but has an approach that is radically inconsistent with Johnson's own as a literary biographer. Among his other achievements, Johnson was a biographer of genius, as he first demonstrated in 1743 with his extraordinary life of his friend Richard Savage, a failed poet and occasionally successful extortionist who believed himself to be the bastard son of an earl and convinced even Johnson of this. Johnson was one of his few relatively loyal friends. Obviously, Dr. Johnson won immortality for his 1755 Dictionary of the English Language, which is a literary as well as a scholarly landmark. Yet perhaps the summit of Johnson's achievements was as a literary critic. He is the greatest, as his 1765 preface to Shakespeare proves beyond all reasonable doubt. In the late 1770s, a consortium of booksellers approached Dr. Johnson to produce a series of prefaces for a multi-volume anthology of English poets from the Restoration to their own times. The result was Johnson's Lives of the Poets, published between 1779 and 1781. This was the last major achievement of the sharpest, most balanced mind in English letters. Johnson's voice as a critic is as close as we will hear in our lifetimes to the voice of God when he judges us at the end of time. He misses nothing, yet his justice and mercy never fail. This is why academics downplay the importance of his work. It frightens them and reminds them of how little they have accomplished themselves, despite not suffering a tenth of what Johnson endured in his own heroic life. When it comes to Milton, Johnson is undoubtedly severe. He presents a damning case for the prosecution on Milton's life, his thoughts, his personality, and much of what he did. On his politics, Dr. Johnson famously pronounces, and I quote, "Milton's republicanism was, I am afraid, founded in an envious hatred of greatness and a sullen desire of independence, in petulance impatient of control, and pride disdainful of superiority. He hated monarchs in the state and prelates in the church, for he hated all whom he was required to obey. It is to be suspected that his predominant desire was to destroy rather than establish, and that he felt not so much the love of liberty as repugnance to authority. It has been observed that they who most loudly clamour for liberty do not most liberally grant it." End quote. Yet, damning though he so often sounds, not even Dr. Johnson can condemn Milton in the final reckoning. The pathetic quality of Milton's sonnets has a generous explanation, and I quote, "Milton's delight was to sport in the wide regions of possibility. Reality was a scene too narrow for his mind." End quote. If modern critics are shocked to see Dr. Johnson find fault even with aspects of Paradise Lost, let it be remembered that it is the work of a man and not of God himself. No Christian should be surprised to find imperfections in it, particularly when part of the point of the work is to explain how and why we are imperfect as mortal men. All of Dr. Johnson's censures fade away when we reach the conclusion of his Life of Milton, and I quote, "He was naturally a thinker for himself, confident of his own abilities and disdainful of help or hindrance. He did not refuse admission to the thoughts or images of his predecessors, but he did not seek them. From his contemporaries, he neither courted nor received support. There is in his writings nothing by which the pride of other authors might be gratified or favor gained. No exchange of praise, nor solicitation of support. His great works were performed under discountenance and in blindness, but difficulties vanished at his touch. He was born for whatever is arduous, and his work is not the greatest of heroic poems, only because it is not the first." Now, let us proceed to some of Milton's own poetry. Paradise Lost is difficult to quote. Milton's unit of composition is not the line, the couplet, or the stanza, but the rolling verse paragraph. He is not a phrase maker, and for its effects, his verse relies on accumulation as well as its cumulative music. I have selected a few passages, all from the beginning of the 12 books of Paradise Lost, because each of these books operates as a discrete unit. And Milton's most inspired passages, unlike Shakespeare's, do not always work well out of context unless there is a lengthy explanatory preface of some sort. You should never read more than a book a day of Paradise Lost, which is best enjoyed over 12 successive evenings. More than that, and the imagination overloads. The first passage I have selected for us is the opening of the third book. This sets up the first appearance of God himself. In the first two books of the epic, Satan and his fallen angels, having been defeated in their rebellion against God and expelled forever from heaven, decide to regroup, take stock of their failures, and plan their next assault on what is good. The third book allows us our first real glimpse of what the fallen angels seek as their prize. Here is how the poet rises from the gloom of the first two books and prefaces our vision of all that is good and holy. And if you'll excuse me, I need a drink before this. Now then. Hail, holy light, offspring of heaven's firstborn, or of the eternal co-eternal beam. May I express thee unblamed, since God is light, and never but in unapproached light, dwelt from eternity, dwelt then in thee, bright effluence of bright essence increate. Or hear'st thou rather pure ethereal stream, whose fountain who shall tell? Before the sun, before the heavens thou wert, and at the voice of God, as with a mantle didst invest the rising world of waters dark and deep, one from the void and formless infinite. Thee I revisit now with bolder wing, escaped the Stygian pool, though long detained in that obscure sojourn, while in my flight, through utter and through middle darkness borne, with other notes than to the Orphean lyre, I sung of chaos and eternal night, taught by the heavenly muse to venture down the dark descent and up to reascend, though hard and rare. Thee I revisit safe, and feel thy sovereign vital lamp. But thou revisit'st not these eyes that roll in vain to find thy piercing ray and find no dawn. So thick a drop serene hath quenched their orbs, or dim suffusion veiled, yet not the more cease I to wonder where the muses haunt, clear spring or shady grove or sunny hill, smit with the love of sacred song, but chief thee, Sion, and the flowery brooks beneath that wash thy hallowed feet and warbling flow. Nightly I visit, nor sometimes forget those other two, equalled with me in fate. So were I equalled with them in renown, blind Tamiris and blind Myonides, and Tiresias and Phineus, prophets old. Then feed on thoughts that voluntary move our civilization. Then feed on thoughts that voluntary move, harmonious numbers, as the wakeful bird sings darkling, and is shadiest covert hid, tones her nocturnal note, thus with the year. Seasons return, but not to me returns day, or the sweet approach of even or morn, or sight of vernal bloom, or summer's rose, or flocks, or herds, or human voice divine. But cloud instead and ever-during dark surrounds me, from the cheerful ways of men cut off, and for the book of knowledge fair presented with a universal blank of nature's works to me expunged and raised, and wisdom at one entrance quite shut out. So much the rather thou, celestial light, shine inward, and the mind through all her powers irradiate, there plant eyes, all mist from thence, purge and disperse, that I may see and tell of things invisible to mortal sight. In the passage we have just heard, Milton is seen gathering his strength to create a vision of something that mortal man will not see in his lifetime, until and unless he is granted the beatific vision after death. Milton might not have been wholly confident of his own eternal salvation, of course. He became fully blind around the age of 43. This seems to have resulted, at least in part, from the strain of his political work. We may wonder whether Milton ever thought of this as divine punishment for his support of violent political rebellion. On the other hand, Milton's blindness gives him a higher sort of vision, the vision of a seer. Homer, referred to above as Myonides, was of course the first poet of our civilization. According to tradition, Homer was blind. So was Tiresias, the mythical prophet of ancient Thebes, who spent 7 years as a woman and was blinded by the gods. Still, he could see the future. Another Thracian prophet mentioned above is Phineus, who was also blinded by the gods, as was the legendary Thracian poet Thamyris, who was punished because he boasted that he could out-sing the muses. In the passage quoted above, we can hear Milton's suffering. Yet he is in part relieved by his gift, which comes from the Holy Spirit, in whom Milton is alleged not to have believed, at least according to university academics, who ought to know better, but alas do not. Then again, what else can you expect from people who claim to spend their lives studying and teaching this poem, yet are dim enough to believe that Satan is the hero. Now, these double-sided pages are a real pain, aren't they? Our next passage comes from the beginning of the 5th book. Here we will have a glimpse of how Milton viewed poetic inspiration. In the 4th book preceding this passage, we see Satan first enter the Garden of Eden. He is eaten up with envy, fear, and despair. In his jealous rage at the love and happiness of Adam and Eve in paradise, he decides to try to tempt Eve in a dream, only to be chased away by the Archangel Gabriel. This passage also reminds us of how sensual Milton can be. And it will forgive me a little bit more preparation. Now mourn her rosies. Not good enough preparation, nor were the Marlborough Reds. Now mourn her rosy steps in the eastern clime, advancing sowed the earth with orient pearl. When Adam waked, so customed, for his sleep was airy light from pure digestion bred, and temperate vapours bland, which the only sound of leaves and fuming rills Aurora's fan, lightly dispersed, and the shrill matin song of birds on every bough. So much the more his wonder was to find unwakened Eve, with tresses discomposed and glowing cheek, as though unquiet, he on his side, leaning half raised with looks of cordial love, hung over her enamoured and beheld beauty, which, whether waking or asleep, shot forth peculiar graces. Then with voice mild, when Zephyrus on Florence breathes, her hand soft touching, whispered thus: "Awake, my fairest, my spoused, my latest found, heaven's last best gift, my ere new delight. Awake, the morning shines and the fresh field cause us, we lose the prime to mark how spring our tended plants, how blows the citron grove, what drops the myrrh and what the balmy reed, how nature paints her colours, how the bee sits on the bloom, extracting liquid sweet." Such whispering waked her, but with startled eye on Adam, whom embracing, thus she spake. And here begins another speech by Eve in which she describes her dream. You will all allow me, I hope, to quote in English from the 1st book of Cicero's dialogue on divination from 44 BC, where he discusses how the time of sleep is favorable to divine communications. And I quote, "Plato's advice to us is to set out for the land of dreams with bodies so prepared that no error or confusion may assail the soul." End quote. This scene of slow awakening perhaps reveals what inspiration felt like for Milton. Sleep and dreams are always of primary importance to prophets no less than poets, because their inspiration so often comes in this state. This is a lovely passage, of course, and Milton's depiction here of conjugal love is unexpected in a poet notorious for what Dr. Johnson called his Turkish contempt for women. But Milton's sympathies are broader than we think they are. Now, our next passage also concerns dreams. This is the opening to the 7th book of Paradise Lost. We are halfway through the epic, just at the point before the Archangel Raphael tells Adam how and why this world was first created. Again, Milton invokes his heavenly muse, as do I. Descend from heaven, Urania, by that name, if rightly thou art called, whose voice divine, following above the Olympian hill I soar, above the flight of Pegasean wing. The meaning, not the name, I call, for thou, nor of the Muses nine, nor on the top of old Olympus dwellst, but heavenly born, before the hills appeared or fountain flowed. Thou with eternal wisdom didst converse, wisdom thy sister, and with her didst play, in presence of the Almighty Father, pleased with thy celestial song. Upled by thee into the heaven of heavens I have presumed, an earthly guest, and drawn imperial air, thy tempering with like safety guided down, return me to my native element, lest from this flying steed unreined, as once Bellerophon, though from lower clime, dismounted on Thalian field I fall, erroneous there to wander and forlorn. Half yet remains unsung, but narrower bound within the visible diurnal sphere, standing on earth, not wrapped above the pole, more safe I sing with mortal voice, unchanged to hoarse or mute, though fallen on evil days though fallen and evil tongues, in darkness and with dangers compassed round and solitude. Yet not alone while thou visit'st my slumbers nightly, or when morn purples the east, still govern thou my song, Urania, and fit audience find, though few. But drive far off the barbarous dissonance of Bacchus and his revellers, the race of that wild rout that tore the Thracian bard in Rhodope, where woods and rocks had ears to rapture, till the savage clamour drowned both harp and voice, nor could the muse defend her son. So fail not thou who thee implores, for thou art heavenly, she an empty dream. As usual, the university academics have got this wrong, being so easily duped. They almost have an excuse this time. In 1823, a long Latin prose text was discovered at the Old State Paper Office and attributed to Milton by the man who discovered it. The title is De Doctrina Christiana, or On Christian Doctrine. It is not to be confused with St. Augustine's Latin treatise of the same name, which I'm certain everybody here has read. The Latin of De Doctrina Christiana is reasonably good. The thinking is not. This is merely a statement of various theological opinions, many of which are heretical. Scholars desperately want Milton to have thought like this, even though the most important theological positions in De Doctrina Christiana simply cannot be made to cohere with what is self-evident, not only in Paradise Lost, but also Paradise Regained. Orthodox Christians find a great deal to reject in De Doctrina Christiana. In Milton's mature poems, little, if anything. One of the silliest commonplaces to have arisen among academics is that Milton was some sort of Unitarian and did not believe in the articles of the Nicene Creed. The author of De Doctrina Christiana did not believe in the existence of the third person of the Holy Trinity. Milton manifestly did. The Holy Spirit is his muse here. The Holy Spirit not only inspired him, it protected him. Bellerophon of Corinth is described at some length in the Iliad. He was a mythical Greek hero who captured the winged horse Pegasus. Exulting in his victory over a monster, he tried to fly to Mount Olympus on the back of Pegasus. Zeus was not pleased. He sent a gadfly to sting Pegasus, and Bellerophon fell to his death. Milton wants Urania, as the Holy Spirit is called here, to protect him not only from this danger, but also from the fate of the legendary poet Orpheus, who was torn to death by Maenads after he rejected their love. Some scholars like to equate the Maenads in this passage with 17th century royalists, who were not merely wild but also drunk. Of course, even a stopped clock tells the right time twice a day. All the same, we wonder why we ever bother to listen to people like this on the subject of inspiration. Our final passage comes from the 9th book of Paradise Lost. Here we reach the climax of the poem. Eve is about to be tempted by the serpent to eat the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge. This is the first tragedy in human history. It gave us original sin, which brought death into the world. No more talk of God, no more of talk where God or angel guessed with man as with his friend familiar used, to sit indulgent and with him partake rural repast, permitting him the while venial discourse unblamed. I now must change those notes to tragic, foul distrust and breach disloyal on the part of man, revolt and disobedience on the part of heaven now alienated, distance and distaste, anger and just rebuke and judgment given, that brought into this world a world of woe, sin in her shadow, death and misery, death's harbinger, sad task yet argument, not less but more heroic than the wrath of stern Achilles on his foe pursued, thrice fugitive about Troy wall, or rage of Turnus for Lavinia disespoused, or Neptune's ire or Juno's that so long perplexed the Greek and Cytherea's son. If answerable style I can obtain of my celestial patroness, who deigns her nightly visitations unimplored, and dictates to me slumbering or inspires, easy my unpremeditated verse. Since first this subject for heroic song pleased me long choosing and beginning late, not sedulous by nature to indite wars, hitherto the only argument heroic deemed chief mastery to dissect, with long and tedious havoc fabled knights in battles feigned the better fortitude of patience and heroic martyrdom unsung, or to describe races and games, or tilting furniture, emblazoned shields, embraces quaint caparisons and steeds, base and tinsel trappings, gorgeous knights at joust and tournament, then marshalled feast, served up in hall with sewers and seneschals. The skill of artifice or office mean, not that which justly gives heroic name to person or to poem. Me of these, not skilled nor studious, higher argument remains sufficient of itself to raise that name, unless an age too late or cold climate or years damp my intended wing depressed, and much they may, if all be mine, not hers, who brings it nightly to my ear. Here, we are amused to listen to Milton trash-talking the competition. His epic is superior to those of classical antiquity, great though they are, because of his inspiration, which comes directly from God in the third person of the Holy Trinity to justify divine ways to mankind. The hope that illuminates his poem is eternal. Unlike Homer and Virgil, Milton has hope of salvation. In this passage, Milton also sets out his superiority to the various romances and epics of the Middle Ages and Renaissance, of which the most distinguished are Ludovico Ariosto's comical, fantastic Orlando Furioso, which first saw light in 1515, and Torquato Tasso's more serious Jerusalem Delivered, published in 1581. Of course, Milton is correct. The only poem in our civilization that might be superior to his would be Dante's Divine Comedy. And yet Milton surely had the greater subject, because we are shown not the progress of one man's immortal soul towards salvation, but all of ours. Both works have a claim on greatness and immortality and must have been divinely inspired, but this is a subject for another discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. We're going to take a quick break now. I think 15 minutes, enough to everyone to get a drink, and then we'll come back and chat a bit more and discuss the thing. So see you in a bit.
I think it does. Well, this is perhaps a controversial opinion, and those
have controversial opinions here.
Yes, I voiced not a few already, but experts on English literature might well disagree with me. But for example, there is literary criticism, for example, in the plays of Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson, who was more or less contemporary of Shakespeare's, he died in, gosh, was it 1621 or 1631? I'm afraid, not having done a degree in English literature, I can't remember. But Ben Jonson does have a fair bit of literary criticism in his work, but it's all by the by. In fact, if you look at the Elizabethans, they do criticize one another and they do exercise judgment, but they never do so systematically. And I think it's not until Dryden's prefaces that you get this attempt to come up with some kind of program for what literature is and what it's doing. This comes a lot earlier in France with the foundation of academies.
So it was sort of top down in France. I mean, most things generally are, but...
Yes. So in the 1630s, Cardinal Richelieu, he founded the French Academy, and the greatest of the early French dramatists is Pierre Corneille. And in the 1630s, he wrote a play called El Cid, which is based on the great Spanish national epic.
I've seen the film.
Yes. It's, the film is a bit regrettable, but the scenery is nice. El Cid does not really conform to the strictures that were being developed for drama. So these are people who took Aristotle extremely seriously. Aristotle, who was Alexander the Great's tutor, of course, he wrote a great deal of, well, he wrote on virtually everything. And one of his most enigmatic texts is a work on the art of poetry, much of which is lost. So we only really have the section on tragedy. And at this point in history, it was thought that Aristotle was generally correct. And if you were going to create tragedy, you must do so on lines that accurately reflect what Aristotle said. So there were great arguments about the drama in particular, and whether, for example, a play can take place plausibly in, the action can take place plausibly within more than the space of one day. So the French Academy was essentially a sort of talking shop for these sorts of rules.
So, people thought you couldn't have a play that was over more than one day.
Yeah, this is not something that happened in practice, but in theory, as is always the case with the French. So
never mind the practice, does it work in theory?
Yes, precisely. And so, for example, there are medieval French dramas where scenes shift and nobody really bothers about it. But Cardinal Richelieu's attempt to found the French Academy was an issue of great national importance and great national prestige. And the most prestigious national drama is that which follows the rules of the best thinkers, which is to say, the thinkers of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So Corneille didn't really pay too much attention to these rules initially. Classicism at this period was very strict. And this is just a French thing, really, and it went on for quite a long time. England never really had this. England did not have a national academy, which argued with the same vehemence about simple rules of how it is you put together a dramatic narrative. So
it's kind of one of those only the French things, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the Italians too at this point in history. Let us be generous in our xenophobia. Yes.
If anyone wants to ask a question, feel free to ask anything, and don't worry about sounding ignorant, because there should be no shame about that, because we're all trying to learn. So, Joseph.
Jaspreet, brilliant lecture. Thank you very much. What is the root of Milton's republicanism, and where is he during the English Civil War?
So the question is, what is the root of Milton's republicanism, and where is he during the Civil War? So Johnson talks about this with a certain amount of force. Milton's republicanism, I think, can be traced back to his resistance in the 1630s to certain tyrannical moves that were made by by Charles I. This is a somewhat complicated story, so I won't tell it right now. But certain very unfair things were done, and Milton, in reaction against this, decided that monarchy, such as it was constituted in his time, was not really a fair system of government that enabled liberty as he understood it. So, his republicanism was purely reactive, but I think Johnson is quite unfair to him. Johnson does not allow Milton to have a completely just republican vision. And this is complex, and I'm afraid I don't know the details well enough. With respect to where he was at the time of the Civil War, well, when it was about to break out, he was in Italy on a grand tour, and he raced back home and decided that the best thing he could do for his country was to establish a private boarding school, which was exceptionally exclusive. I think the largest number of students was about half a dozen. But they were very well trained in Latin and Greek, which is always important for liberty. Yet he had friends who thought that his gifts were being wasted, and so he ended up as Cromwell's Latin secretary. So he was exceptionally powerful and influential for a period. And he gained this eminence through being a pamphleteer through the 1640s. Presumably, everybody here has heard of Milton's Areopagitica, which is, I think, 1643 or 44. I'm afraid I can't remember the date. And this is regarded as one of the great foundational texts for free speech by those who haven't read it. Milton's views are, shall we say, complex. So he was a schoolmaster who became an exceptionally effective pamphleteer, and this led to his rising in eminence enough that he ended up becoming quite influential throughout parts of the 1640s and 1650s. Does that answer your question, more or less?
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Was he sort of in favour of free speech for people like himself? So that kind of free speech?
More or less. Precisely as I am. I don't like free speech from people who disagree with me either, so his views are exceptional.
Russell?
You just mentioned his career as a pamphleteer, and you mentioned his friendships or lack of them, I think, in your talk. I read in Anna Kay's book, The Restless Republic, about his very good friendship with the newspaperman Marchman Needham.
Yes.
I just wondered what you made of that.
Well, I think I was being funny rather than true in talking about Milton's lack of friendship, because it's quite clear that he had. A small group of people who always admired his intellect and his force. With respect to this particular friendship, I shouldn't comment too much further because I'm afraid you and I have read about it in the same source. And I don't really have the learning to say too much about this period. I'm afraid my expertise is Florence in the 15th century rather than England in the 17th. So I'd better be careful whilst there's a camera running.
What does Anna Kay say about it?
Well, basically, Marchant Needham is sort of somebody who always changes sides just at the wrong moment.
Yeah.
So he backs the royalists just as they're about to lose, and then
Yeah.
he swings behind the, he's always on the run, and he ends up this very disreputable character, but very good company. He's practically the first newspaper man in England, and he becomes best mates with Milton, which seems an extraordinary sort of pairing of the two, but apparently they got on absolutely famously, this sort of disreputable, broad, red top merchant of his time, and this super serious Milton. So it just seems a very odd relationship that they have.
The reason I'm biting my tongue is that modern equivalents spring too quickly to mind. So I draw a discreet veil over those whom I could think of instantly who are parallel to this. But Milton, I think, is a more consistent thinker than this. Milton does not really abandon his positions. He has a real sense of intellectual honor. And this is one of the more admirable things about him. His views do develop, so he's not rigid. And in fact, I think with respect to his theological views, Milton definitely developed over the course of the 1640s. Now, the political views are trickier. I am taking a view which is perhaps not that well supported, which is that, or in fact is perhaps not popular among scholars, which is that Milton may well have repented of his extreme republicanism by the Restoration. And not purely because of consequences that he may have faced, but it seems unlikely that someone would have written a poem like Paradise Lost from the point of view which Milton is caricatured as having held in the 1640s, if that makes a certain amount of sense.
At the time, what is the general view of the poem in regards to the Civil War?
Well, this is...
if it's debated now, but
yeah.
Presumably it can be interpreted different ways.
Well, there was a certain silence about Milton generally among critics until the so-called Glorious Revolution. Because...
Say from so-called, you're not a huge fan.
How'd you guess?
Subtle.
Yes. But at the time of the so-called Glorious Revolution, it became okay to celebrate Milton in ways that were perhaps not politically correct by the standards of the time prior to 1688-89. Over the past couple of days, I've been looking at the critical heritage of Milton in various anthologies of 17th and 18th century writings about Milton. And it's interesting that his mild toxicity as a Republican seems to influence views. People uniformly accept his greatness. As to whether he was right in the views that he was famous throughout Europe for having held, that was something nobody particularly wanted to discuss. Even though I think the Restoration allowed for 1,000 flowers to bloom far more than is generally acknowledged. Violent republicanism was not necessarily accepted, but Milton got by for 15 years, or 14 years, without too much in the way of consequences. So I think people were just rather cautious to voice very much about this, out of prudence and perhaps cowardice. It's hard to say.
Any other questions?
Yes. So it's two questions. So first of all, would Milton have been able to assume knowledge of Homer and Virgil amongst his readership of Paradise Lost, and if so, can we still appreciate the poem without that full knowledge of those epics?
Thank you. So the question is, would Milton have expected knowledge of Homer and Virgil amongst his initial audience? And can we, as readers who don't necessarily have that background, appreciate it? So I'll answer the second question first. Of course, you can appreciate Milton without a classical education. I think it's slightly more difficult. However, the quality of Milton's language is such, the beauty of Milton's language is such, that you can essentially get something out of it even if you don't recognize the references to classical epic. And I think that's very important. People should not be scared off of Milton just because they don't have an A-level in Latin or whatever. He is a national poet, and whilst he is difficult for those who don't have Latin, I think you can still fight through him. This is why I say don't read more than a book of Milton a day, because when you do, if you only recite a book a day in front of your captive and rather grudging family, you at least have some opportunity to discuss it, to wrestle with passages afterwards. I would say it's important to appreciation of the poem, but I don't think it's absolutely essential. And to go to your first question, as to whether Milton's initial audience had, perhaps Milton's initial fit audience, though few, had Latin and Greek. Well, I think he could take for granted among those who would appreciate his work that everybody at least had Latin. So this is an interesting question with respect to the classical tradition generally. By and large, within the educated tradition of English literature, one can take for granted that a given poet between let's say Shakespeare and Tennyson would have expected his audience to have had at least a smattering of Latin, even if it wasn't as great as we tend to think it was. You would be expected to know maybe books 1, 2, 4, and 6 of Virgil's Aeneid, a bit of Ovid, and whatever you could throw together after that. I don't think Milton necessarily expected Greek on the part of his initial readership or audience. And we should remember also that the first edition of Paradise Lost in 1667 was 1,300 copies, and it took about 2 years for another 1,300 to be printed. He got a fiver for the copyright, and I don't think more than 5,000 or 6,000 people in total read the poem before Milton's death in 1674. That doesn't sound like a lot to us. Actually, when you think about poetry in general, and when you think that the standard size of the audience for English poetry in London has always been about 2,000 or 3,000 people maximum, 5,000 or 6,000 is not bad. And in fact, I would say that some appreciation of Homer definitely helps, but I'm not entirely certain that Milton regarded that as necessary. It was more the Latin. Does that answer your question more or less? Okay.
What would, I guess, a people's history of Milton and Paradise Lost be over the last 350 years? And we would have sat in a room like this and listened to talks about Paradise Lost.
Okay, so the question is, what would a people's history of Milton's Paradise Lost over the past 350 years be? And what would be the sort of group of people who would sit in a room like this and listen to some Burke in a corduroy suit talking about it? Well, I think that Milton had an increasingly large popular audience after the glorious, so-called Glorious Revolution. And certainly in the 19th century, a fair amount of Milton was not uncommon amongst interested people. I'm afraid this is not really an area of my expertise, but if you look at literacy in the 18th and 19th centuries, and you think about the level of learning attained by those in prior generations who left school at the age of 14, it was pretty high. We've all met people who are now in their 70s and 80s who left school at the age of 14 and can reel off just line after line of Shelley, Keats, Shakespeare, and the great English poets. And I think a lot of those people knew their Milton rather well. So to return to your earlier question, those who were able to enjoy Milton did not necessarily have classical educations, but the language is so rich. And in fact, I think if you want to appreciate Milton, at a deep level, the classical tradition is not the only important one. You really ought to know the King James Bible. We forget just how steeped previous generations were in scripture. Those of us who know people, again, in their 70s today, who can recite the Psalms just off the top of their heads to a degree that would embarrass and shame a divinity graduate from Cambridge or theology graduate from Oxford, is in fact pretty impressive. And the passages I quoted are deeply enriched by that background. Another area which is worth looking into is Milton in America, because Milton was a Puritan and America has a very deep Puritan culture. And those who are... So I don't know very much about the reception of Milton in America during this, in the 18th or 19th centuries. What I do know is that in the 19th century, you had this extraordinary phenomenon of, for example, miners in Colorado who knew their Shakespeare exceptionally well because the only books they had at home would be a copy of the King James Bible and the collected works of Shakespeare. And so, in fact, in the 1840s, there was a Shakespeare riot in New York. I think 120 people were injured. I can't remember how many were killed because there was a controversy between an English Shakespearean actor and a homegrown American product with respect to the quality of performance. So Milton was a part of popular culture, I think, prior to the age of the cinema. And I think it's deeply regrettable with poetry in general that over the past century, it has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk in terms of its popular audience. I hesitate to spell out my strong reservations about modernism and the modern movement, because I sound like a horrific reactionary. Whereas I'm quite a nice reactionary, I think. And I think that what has turned people away from Shakespeare and Milton in terms of popular culture has not just been the rise of certain elements in mass culture, but also the fact that we're taught, and over the past centuries in schools, we are taught an attitude towards poetry in general, which is quite intimidating, actually. We all remember our school editions of Milton, which have got these horrible footnotes, which say, this relates to something you haven't read either. And I think this is deeply destructive. I don't think it's helpful. And speaking as someone who has actually read these texts, I can say that they're not always as helpful as the scholars wish they were. So the popular reception of Milton, I'm sorry to use the academic term reception, I wish there were a better one, but the popular reception of Milton has diminished precisely due to misguided trends within education above all, which ought to be making these things more accessible to people, rather than giving them this false and silly idea that they're only for people with doctorates. So if there's one thing that I'd like to do, and I think, Ed, you would agree with this very much, I think I would like to restore Milton as part of the common property of everybody who speaks English. This is part of your inheritance as a speaker of this great language, which continues to rule the world. Far more so than French.
I remember reading, I might have got this wrong, but when the first cohorts of Labour MPs came in, and they were asked which books inspired you most, and the Bible was not one by far.
Yep.
I think Milton was, I might have got that wrong, but I'm pretty sure Milton was up there. And Karl Marx was nowhere, but it would have been sort of among the sort of, as you say, the kind of common inheritance.
Yes, and in fact, I don't denigrate Karl Marx for the quality of his writing or his learning. Marx was a pretty solidly good classicist, and he knew his Shakespeare very well, and he knew his Shakespeare very well as well. I have a few other minor arguments with him. However, we can't fault one, his learning, or two, his talent. If you read Marx's journalism, he was an extraordinary writer, and part of the persuasive power of Marx is not, in fact, the principles he comes up with. It's the fact that Marx's rhetoric and his observations are those of someone who was a serious writer. We should always take serious writers seriously. I realize that this is unfashionable in an age when most of our politicians have got these vulgar degrees in PPE. Sorry, are there any PPEists in the room? Okay, jolly good. We'll talk to you afterwards. The fact that Milton was a great inspiration to the labor movement is, I think, a testament to his ability to communicate. When Milton said that he was composing his work for fit audience, though few, I think he was a bit too pessimistic. He can communicate with everybody. And the grandeur of his verse is such that it communicates even if you don't necessarily understand the individual bits of diction. And actually, here's a pro tip for those of you who are somewhat resistant to Milton's quite Latinate diction. If you look up, if you have a copy of Paradise Lost and you're reading along with it, and you find a word like argument, which he uses. So argument in argument in Latin is not argument in the sense of people yelling at each other. A lot of the time it's just the material for a piece of writing. So if you have a copy, possibly online, but ideally on your desk, a very heavy copy of Lewis and Short's Latin Dictionary, and you look up the Latin-derived words in Milton as you read along, you'll find that it becomes a lot easier. You'll find that, and this is a problem with Milton, his syntax can be quite Latinate, but that was no bar to people who did not have a classical education. Have I more or less answered your question?
More than.
Excellent.
We're running a bit over the scheduled time, so if anyone needs to go and got things to do, I won't be offended. We won't be minutes, so, but we're going to have a couple more questions. Does anyone in the audience want to? Is there a hand right at the back?
Right at the back.
Milton's a Puritan.
Yep.
You made the point about there were those who discovered that later piece of work who tried to essentially paint him as a heretic and therefore invalidate Paradise Lost. But as a religious work, all right, one that ends in salvation, so there's a lot of the Reformed Church won't, the predestination guys, the Calvinists aren't going to like it. Now, given it is a religious work, over the course of the last 350 years, has any formal church used it as a compliment, or approved it, or used it as a, I know it's highbrow rather than a catechism, but has it ever been used or approved as an herb, a complementary herb to any particular branch of Christianity?
That is an excellent question. So for those of you who didn't hear, was Paradise Lost used as a kind of supplementary oeuvre for religious instruction or for introducing people to Christian teaching? And my answer is, I wish it were. I'm not aware of any church that has used Paradise Lost as a means of introducing people to Christian teachings. And yet, now I've read shockingly little C.S. Lewis. And I hope this doesn't offend anybody. The reason why is because people who talk constantly about the Inklings are terrifically boring. However, I've found latterly, and I think somewhat grudgingly, that C.S. Lewis is in fact very good. And like Mark Twain and Charles Dickens, and writers of this quality, you must not know him by the bores who preach in his name. C.S. Lewis could not find anything unorthodox in Milton, more or less. And certainly those of us who have hilariously hardline opinions on Christian teaching generally have, for the most part, not really found anything to object to. Even the hard Calvinism in Milton is, in Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, somewhat muted. So an interesting work to read in this respect is St. John Henry Cardinal Newman's The Idea of a University. Now, St. John Henry Cardinal Newman is one of the great prose stylists of the 19th century. Everybody ought to try to read his Apologia Pro Vita Sua. I admit that some pages might be skipped, but that's true of every great writer, I suppose. He's very sound and very sensible on the fact that, in his view, Orthodox literature from a Catholic point of view was in a state of development when Milton was writing in the 19th century. So when Newman was writing in the 19th century. I think it's been a great failure on the part of the churches not to bring in someone like Milton as part of their teaching. Because really there's little that you could describe as eccentric from a Christian point of view in Paradise Lost, or Paradise Regained for that matter. And I won't say anything nasty about Paradise Regained, which is the sequel. And many would regard it in sequel terms as being a bit like The Godfather Part 3, as opposed to Part 2. And I think that's unfair. Had anybody other than Milton composed that, it would have been regarded as one of the lesser masterworks of English poetry. And that too is something that could be brought into catechesis quite easily. So my answer to your question is, I'm not aware that this has been brought in, and I think it reflects very badly on the churches that it hasn't as a text in teaching.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions before I go on? Yeah, Will.
So you mentioned that Milton was Cromwell's Latin secretary.
Yes.
What is a Latin secretary?
So I mentioned that Milton is a Latin secretary. What is a Latin secretary? A Latin secretary is someone who translates correspondence into Latin, which was then the international language all over Europe. So Milton's work was essentially in PR. We might describe him as a kind of communications director for Oliver Cromwell. And he didn't do so much work. Latinists tend not to do that much work. But they helped give Milton a sort of international reputation, particularly in some of his violent disputes, including with someone, with a Latinist named Salmasius, who claimed that he was responsible for making Milton go blind. Milton, in turn, said that he was responsible for making Salmasius die. It was a violent dispute. These are people who were far more vehement about in their personal attacks than people are on Twitter. So, as a Latin secretary, he was essentially a kind of government spokesman. As to how far he directed policy, I would leave that to the experts. Does that answer your question more or less? Okay.
I've just got one more question before we wrap up. The question earlier about knowing Latin and Greek would be assumed amongst some of the audience.
Yeah.
But the bigger hurdle, I suppose, I wasn't taught Milton at school, and I don't believe my children are, as far as I know, some of them a bit younger, but I was told a story by someone I know about working in an office, these sort of high-powered office in the States, sort of very educated people, and a visitor from the same company, but who came from Africa, came along and started talking to them and said, "Oh yeah, so it's a bit like the prodigal son," and they all looked at him and said, "What's that?" And my point being that without the sort of very kind of understanding of Christianity, Milton is going to seem completely incomprehensible to someone who hasn't been raised in that background, or at least has a strong knowledge of it. I mean, isn't that the sort of biggest problem for the poets in the modern age? I mean, it's almost like another language.
Yes. That's a hurdle, but it's not an insurmountable one. People who go to very Christian schools come out of it having no knowledge whatsoever of the Bible. I talked to friends of mine who allegedly had the most Protestant education imaginable in this country and have gone through famous Christian institutions and cannot recognize a reference to the epistles of St. Paul, for example. And I don't think this is a hurdle to appreciation of Milton. On the contrary, I think Milton is so great and so rich that those who fall in love with his verse can use that as an inspiration to come to learn Holy Writ. I think his sheer inspiration is such that whilst appreciation of the Bible helps, I think he helps us appreciate the Bible. I think that Milton as a poet is a great teacher, and this was, I think, one of his roles. So I think if you read Milton and try to introduce others to his work, if your knowledge of the Bible is based on 1990s episodes of the first 10 seasons of The Simpsons.
Best seasons.
Yes. After season 11, it really went downhill. Yes, shame. But in fact, I think it went downhill possibly midway through season 9. But this is an argument for another session of the Canon Club, surely. But I don't think this is a serious bar to appreciation. The music of his language is so great that he opens the door. It's the same thing with Shakespeare. I think that you don't come in with that much, but we have to remember that Shakespeare, like Milton, was writing for ordinary people. And for most of us, 90% of what we've learned is in one eye and out the other, or in one ear and out the other, depending on how we access this knowledge. So it's not a matter of being intimidated by our lack of knowledge of certain aspects. Those who believe in the so-called natural law tend to think that a lot of the wisdom that we find in a poet like Milton is more or less obvious, and we don't need to be taught it, we just need to be reminded of it. So I don't regard this as a bar to appreciation at all.
Very good. Well, anyway, that's any more questions, then I will wrap it up, and just want to say thank you so much, Jaspreet, for a fantastic talk. I feel my IQ has gone up 5 points already. And I hope everyone has thanks to everyone who's come. It's been fantastic, and I'm going to stick around for a little bit.
Yes. IQs may have gone up 5 points. Let's bring them down another 20.